as you're coming in, please take a moment and introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know where you're from and what your interest and background is, and make sure you click everyone so that everyone can see, not just attendees. And the structure will be like all the webinars. We'll have some conversation and then we'll open it up for a Q&A. And if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box, not the chat, because I'm not able to read both at the same time. And again, welcome as you're joining. Please introduce yourself in the chat. And I'm going to go ahead and get started and share my screen. As you all know, today this is one of the webinars, the American Botanical Council and Sustainable Herbs Program Ethnobotany webinar series. And I'm thrilled to be speaking with Dennis McKenna today about science and ethnopharmacology. We'll turn to that in a moment. And as you know, there's also the other toolkit webinar series, and these are conversations that explore looking at best practices in the botanical industry, really trying to raise the bar around sustainability and regenerative practices so that sourcing is more responsible. And I'm very much looking forward to the webinar on April 22nd, where we'll be looking at certifications as a tool in the broader journey to sustainability. It'll really be looking at what those accomplish and what they don't accomplish. And then on May 20th, will be a joint webinar with the Fair Wild Foundation. And that'll be looking more at business practices around wild harvesting. And as always, these webinars are made available for free through the generous support of the Sustainable Herbs Program underwriters. And you can see these companies here and organizations. You can find out more information on them all at the Sustainable Herbs Program website. And they're also made available through the generous support of American Botanical Council members. You can find out more information about joining the American Botanical Council at herbalgram.org. And so with that, I want to turn to the conversation today with Dennis McKenna, who likely does not need an introduction by me. Dennis McKenna is an iconic ethnopharmacologist who's been a leader in exploring the therapeutic and ritual uses of mind-altering substances for over 40 years. He's a founding board member of the Hefter Research Institute and was a key investigator in the Ayahuasca project, the first biomedical investigation of ayahuasca. In 2019, he incorporated a new nonprofit, the McKenna Academy of Natural Philosophy, which is described as being an incubator to nourish the emergence of a new global consciousness, which sounds like a really good thing to do. So I'm really excited to speak with you today, Dennis. And I thought perhaps as a way to begin, I wonder if there's a story you have that really first aroused your curiosity in this, what has become your lifelong exploration of plants and plant chemistry.
Well, thank you, Anne, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a advisor to the American Botanical Council, have been for years, and I am really honored to be invited. I have immense respect for what you folks do. I think herbal education and education about plant medicines is so important. And a lot of what is published in the scientific literature is just a little beyond many people, you know, and a lot of other material out there on the web is simplistic or not factual. So the American Botanical Council's commitment to facts and communication, explaining the importance of herbal medicines to a wider public is a really invaluable mission, and I'm happy to be a small part of it. As far as my encounters or my interest in psychedelics, I go way back. I guess my story is I'm a child of the 60s. I was born in 1950. So my teenage years were the 60s, and toward the latter part of the 60s was the counterculture and the whole hippie movement and all that. And at that time there was a lot of talk about LSD and other psychedelics and their potential to change the world. We all were convinced that they were going to save the world in some ways. Some of us still have that delusion, and actually it may not be a delusion, but I don't think it's LSD that's going to do it. It's looking like potentially it may be psilocybin. But my own personal, you asked for a story, my own personal involvement with all this was in part due to my brother's influence. He was 4 years older than I am. And so in some ways, he kind of led me down the primrose path. And not that I regret it. In the late 60s, what crossed our radar that was rare at the time, but that was very influential for both of us, was DMT. And DMT was not widely available at the time, but my brother was able to work the matrix and we had it. And it was very impressive. It seemed much more interesting than LSD, which was about the only thing we had it to compare it to. And that was what really started my fascination with psychedelics, was this DMT experience. And as I often say, it was not only the most interesting drug we had encountered, it was the most interesting thing that we had encountered. And I have to say that 52 years later, that's still true. I think DMT is a very interesting compound. And of course, it's part of this family of natural psychedelics, the tryptamines, which includes psilocybin. Psilocybin is also a tryptamine, very closely related to DMT. But it was DMT and the quest to understand it that really got me interested in psychedelics. And then at the same time, around the age of 18, I stumbled across the Ethnopharmacologic Search for Psychoactive Drugs, which was a proceedings of a symposium that was held in San Francisco in when was it? It was 1968, I believe. It was a closed symposium, but they published the proceedings of this. And it was called the Ethnopharmacologic Search for Psychoactive Drugs. And this book fell into my hands. The symposium was in 1967, and the book was published a year later. When I got hold of this book, it really brought forward to me that there was science behind this. This just wasn't a bunch of hippies out there getting loaded. It was actually a bunch of indigenous people out there getting loaded. And that was very interesting to me. So that's what triggered sort of, or incentivized me to pursue a degree in, as it turned out, botany, but the subject was really ethnopharmacology. So I did that. I took a master's at the University of Hawaii, and then I went to University of British Columbia and focused my studies on ayahuasca for my doctoral research. As you know, I'm not with the short answers, right? Sorry.
Oh, that's great. Well, and I just want to draw you to continue talking, but what is fascinating about the work you've been doing is the intersection and overlap between spirit and culture and chemistry, with the plants maybe at the center. And I'm interested in your reflections. What can often be a tension, especially between spirit and chemistry, perhaps? Is how your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, ethnopharmacology, by definition, is a very inherently interdisciplinary science, and it does involve, I mean, the ethno part is people and how people use plants, in this case, particularly psychoactive plants, or at least biologically active plants, as medicines. And the pharmacology part, it encompasses everything that pharmacology is about, which is how these drugs work, what the chemistry is, and so on. So it's inherently interdisciplinary. And that was one of the things that attracted me about it. And there is still a lot to learn about. If the focus of this webinar is more or less on psychedelics, there's still, I'm convinced there are more to be discovered. And in fact, a few have been reported in recent times. So I think the psychedelic plants that are well known, better known, like ayahuasca and peyote, San Pedro cactus, the many species of mushrooms, that is not the end of the story. There are many other psychotropic, psychoactive plants and fungi to be discovered and explored, both from the standpoint of their ethnographic uses and their chemistry. And so I pursued that all my life. In 2017, I organized a 50th anniversary symposium about the ethnopharmacologic search for psychoactive drugs. And if you look at espd50.com, you can see the speakers and what we discussed and so on. So ethnopharmacology is anything but a obsolete, outdated 20th century science. It is potentially, it's a very vibrant discipline. I mean, you never know it based on the amounts of funding it gets and so forth, but people are noticing. And now that there's a sort of a refocus on psychedelics and their potential for therapy, there's also a refocus on psychedelic chemistry from both the synthetic angle and the natural products direction. So I think the 21st century is, I think that ethnopharmacology still has a lot to contribute for the rest of the 21st century.
I'm curious how so the book that you came across from that first conference, and then I was looking at the videos from the recent conference you organized, how has the discipline changed in that, was it 50 years? Were they asking similar questions in different areas, or deeper questions, or how did it?
Well, it's changed in various ways. I mean, ethnopharmacology has never been a well-funded branch of ethnobotany. Of course, ethnobotany is not particularly well-funded. These are important sciences that are neglected in some ways, at least in terms of the recognition. Their importance is not commensurate with the amount of financial support that they that they get. And so I think that I don't exactly know what to say. I think that that as we make these discoveries, well, here's an example. Here's one good example, possibly. A lot of the discoveries of importance that kind of emerge through ethnopharmacology are only recognized for their significance until later. For example, there is this Mexican mint, Salvia divinorum, which is I wouldn't call it a psychedelic, strictly it's not, but it's a profoundly mind-altering plant that is used in Mazatec culture, the same culture that uses psilocybe mushrooms. And what's interesting about it, this has all been reported in the ethnopharmacologic literature, and the chemistry of the active principles of salvia have been elucidated. It's a diterpene called salvinorin A. And that's unusual because it is the most potent and most selective kappa opiate agonist so far discovered. And it's remarkable that this natural product has the highest affinity for these kappa opiate receptors than any synthetic known by orders of magnitude. It is actually the most potent psychoactive compound so far found in nature. Its activity is comparable to LSD at that level of 50 micrograms or so. So out of ethnopharmacology emerges this completely sort of unexpected compound. Most psychedelics are alkaloids. They contain nitrogen. They can be, related to these different classes of alkaloids. And salvinorin A comes completely from left field. And a person, Brian Roth at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, is a serotonin pharmacologist, a psychopharmacologist. He elucidated the mechanism of action for salvinorin A and determined that it was this amazingly selective kappa opiate receptor agonist. And he told me, he said, if I had set out to design a compound using computer-aided drug design to target those receptors, it wouldn't have looked anything like salvinorin A. He said, the stuff looks like cholesterol. It's very lipophilic. And basically, what I took away from that was no chemist, no drug designer would ever have come up with a compound like that if they set out to do it. But the plants came up with it. And the plants, this just demonstrates plants are more creative chemists than people. And, the astute chemists looking for these compounds will take a leaf from the plants, no pun intended, a leaf from the page of the plants to look at some of these natural structures, see how they work, and then potentially develop analogs, which is traditionally what you do in medicinal chemistry. You isolate something and then you tweak it and you see what may modify the activity. So now in the case of salvinorin A, for example, there are many analogs that have been developed and are being looked at, for example, in Roland Griffith's lab at Johns Hopkins, and it's not clear that it has therapeutic activity that can really be fit into a clinical context, but it's useful for looking at mechanisms. Just on the pure research level, we now have this molecular probe for the kappa opiate receptors that we did not have before. And we have the experiential reports of the extremely bizarre and otherworldly effects of salvinorin A, not your typical psychedelic, and who knew that this part of human consciousness was actually linked to the kappa opiate receptors. So discovery kind of goes along, one step forward, one step back, but there is progress.
I'm interested then if you could talk a little more about, so there's the human consciousness opening potential, and then there's the danger of abuse, and often in that, say in ayahuasca, the research you were doing, I assume, it's within a cultural context and framework that ayahuasca is being used, a set of ritual practices. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on the relationship between these practices and the culture, the framework.
Well, so a lot of these psychedelics are going global now, right? Things like ayahuasca is probably the best example, or iboga. These were always used within an indigenous context, within a ritual and therapeutic context that was specific to different indigenous cultures. They have this cultural context. Now they're expanding, and a lot of people, you can access things like ayahuasca. You can basically order the ingredients online and prepare it yourself. And some people do that. What you can order online are the ritual part of it, the context. It's important that these psychedelics are used in a structured context, the old set and setting trope. You have to optimize the set which is your set is your mindset, what you bring to it, your expectations, and really everything that you've learned that you bring to this experience that might be relevant to it. And the setting is much more straightforward. It's the circumstances under which you do it. And indigenous people have been using these things for 5,000 years or 10,000 years, and they've learned a thing or two, which I think the contemporary psychotherapeutic community could benefit from taking, again, looking at that model as a way to optimally use these substances. I sometimes tell people ayahuasca is a liquid. Ayahuasca will fill any vessel that you create for it, and it's important that there be a vessel. It does not have to be an indigenous traditional practice, but it might have elements of that. It might have elements of modern psychotherapy. Some kind of hybrid between those things is now what is happening. And that's probably a good thing, because, most of people who are going to benefit from these psychedelics, they're not indigenous people. They're not within that cultural context. So you can borrow from those traditions, but we really have to work within a tradition. We have to create our own traditions around these things and our own practice that works for us as 21st century people, scientifically grounded and so on. But at the same time, acknowledging the wisdom and the sort of hard-earned experience of the indigenous people. They didn't get to where they are by being stupid. They know what they're doing. And so we can learn from that.
And is that some of with the School of Natural Philosophy that you're creating? And from what I've looked at the website, it seems that you're trying to create that container for the potential of that mind-opening, expansive aspects.
Yes. The academy is basically educational, and as you can tell by the title, and our agenda initially was to organize conferences around the topics of plant medicines, organize events around the taking of plant medicines in highly structured, supportive sets and settings. That's still part of our agenda, but that is a big part of our agenda. But COVID has kind of put all that on the back burner for now, because we can't offer those kinds of events. So what we're trying to do now is offer educational opportunities online. We're trying to develop a really strong presence on the web and participate in webinars like this. We've offered several ourselves. We have a podcast series that we've been working with. I interviewed, for example, Brian Morescu recently to discuss his book, The Immortality Key, and we'll be putting that online in a few weeks. So basically, we're working with what we can do, and right now, what we can do is online, not unfortunately in physical places. But so we face the same dilemma a lot of people do. I mean, we would all prefer to gather in a room and share the medicine and share experiences and so on, but we can't do that for now. So we do what we can.
Yeah, all right, and hopefully it'll
Yeah.
shift. So I wanted
Hopefully
to
it will.
go back and stay
Yeah.
with the benefits. And when I was listening to some of the presentations from the conference and talking about that, I forget who it was, but he was talking about the chemicals as sort of messengers that communicate across membranes, and just what insights these chemicals in the plants offer that's especially important at this moment in time, given the state of our relationship with the earth, and maybe particular to those in a more Western divided culture, disconnected culture. Curious.
Well, yes. I mean, that you probably heard that from me or somebody who was talking about it. Not that I'm the only one, but I think yes. I think that these psychedelic chemicals, which chemically resemble neurotransmitters, right? Almost all of them affect neurotransmitters in some way or another. And the true psychedelics, the things like LSD and mescaline, affect the serotonin system primarily, the serotonin system of neurotransmitters. But I've spoken of these small molecules essentially as messengers from Gaia in a certain way. They're, if you believe in the Gaia hypothesis, and I do, in the sense that I think the entire community of biospheric species, the biosphere itself, is kind of an intelligent organism, and it senses threats to its stability. And right now, we're the biggest threat. These crazy monkeys that are crawling all over the place and destabilizing all the systems that maintain equilibrium in the biosphere. So one of the ways that the biosphere can respond is by facilitating the discovery and use of these messenger molecules. That's what they are, essentially. These plants are great chemists, and they make many, many compounds that are not just related to metabolism or internal chemical processes. They make this whole class of secondary compounds, so-called, that really mediate their relationships with other organisms in the environment, ranging from bacteria and fungi in the soil to animals that might want to nibble on them or might want to consume them or might want to use them for nutrient. And that includes people, and people, if people randomly consume compounds or plants that have psychoactive compounds in them, they're going to get the message, and the message may be various things, but they will find an interesting effect. And if it's pleasant, it often isn't. It's often, I mean, a lot of people have said about salvia divinorum, for example, one and done, never again. But other people actually do like it. Anyway, the interaction between these natural compounds and an individual provides an incentive to form a symbiosis with the plant. And that's what we see happening. Symbiosis in the sense that, we domesticate it, we take care of it, we propagate it. Now we've reached a point where we're actually endangering it, because we love things like ayahuasca so much that over harvesting and those sorts of issues come up. But the message of the plants and the biosphere in general, very often people come away from their experience realizing how out of sync we are with nature, how we've lost that harmonious relationship from nature and we become estranged from it. And that's because in part we become separated from it. We insulate ourselves in our homes. We retreat to these online environments because that's what we have to do, but we lose that link. And so the psychedelics can serve as a reminder of this relationship that we're losing, and we have to get straightened out about this, because if we don't make these changes, we we cannot do what we can uh, to at least slow down, if not reverse, these processes that are rapidly leading to the destabilization of the Gaian mechanisms, you might say, the mechanisms at the biosphere level that make life on Earth possible. The conditions for that support life. Earth has gone through tremendous changes since life appeared on Earth, probably about 4.3 billion years ago. I mean, that's kind of the earliest marker for it. But at no time have conditions on the Earth reached a place where it can't support life, and like the temperature, the salinity of the ocean, the gaseous composition of the atmospheres go through wild fluctuations, but always within parameters that some kind of life can tolerate. And there have been events in evolution where 95% of terrestrial species have gone extinct, but something's left over, and then it rebounds and usually results in a evolutionary period of where biodiversity explodes. These are not slow process. These are not fast processes. We're talking timescales of hundreds of millions of years, but that's been the pattern. Now, for the first time in our biosphere, there's a species that potentially could fatally disrupt these equilibrium processes to a point where they can't rebound, they can't recover, and then we're in big trouble. So I think the plants bring to us an important lesson about how we have to wake up and re-understand our relationship to the biosphere and work in symbiosis and harmony with the biosphere. Nature does not exist for us to exploit and deplete and destroy, which is pretty much what we've been doing, at least, well, at least since the beginning of the Anthropocene, and opinions differ as to when the Anthropocene started, but one marker you could lay down was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and when we started relying on machine manufacturing, we had the steam engine, we had other technologies that basically increased efficiency, but they were also polluting. And that was the beginning of the, injection of megatons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. It all started with the Industrial Revolution, which is, about a couple hundred years ago. So.
And do you think that is the seed of that disconnection, the sense of the earth or Gaia is not a living system, but it's this mechanistic thing that we don't have to pay attention to, that we're not connected to? And
right. We think of it as a mechanistic thing. I mean, it's not a woo-woo new age concept to think of Gaia as an intelligent system. This is all based, the scientific concept of Gaia is based on the work of James Lovelock. He's the one who came up with that hypothesis. And the hypothesis is very simple and almost self-evident, that life itself, the reason that the Earth is hospitable to life itself is that life itself is manipulating and maintaining the parameters that optimize the existence of life, or if not optimize it, at least make it possible. Many factors tend to throw it out of equilibrium. It's not just human activity. Right now, human activity is the big destabilizer. But, when a 6-mile wide asteroid slams into what's now the Gulf of Mexico, that's pretty destabilizing too. And if we look back at the fossil record, it's pretty clear that happened. And that kind of marks the boundary that was the end of the dinosaurs and the rise of the age of mammals. But again, that took hundreds of millions of years to play out. So it was quite destabilizing. Just if you don't think so, just ask the dinosaurs, except there isn't one around to ask because they're all dead. But that's the thing. The Earth and the solar system environment and space in general, it's not a hospitable place. And the fact that these species have evolved on this planet to maintain this beautiful refuge for life, I think is something we need to appreciate more. I I mean, I'm interested in extraterrestrial life. One of my earlier hobbies and focuses, and still is to an extent, was astronomy and astrophysics. I hope that life permeates the universe, that life is common in these star systems that have planets, which we now understand there are many. I hope that many of those systems are populated with life, but I actually have my doubts. I think that life, here's what I think. I think that life is common at the simple level, at the unicellular level. I think there are many planets where the conditions exist that microbial life can appear, but then it doesn't go anywhere. And it takes special sets of circumstances for life to cross that threshold into higher complexity that leads eventually to conscious beings and big brain primates like us. I think that's extremely rare in the galaxy and in the universe as a whole. If we look back at the evolutionary history of the Earth, it conforms to that model. If life appeared 4.8 billion years ago, well, probably 4.3 is the marker now. If life appeared 4.3 billion years ago, it was mostly microbial life. It was microbial life. Unicellular life, multicellular life didn't really get started until about 500 million years ago. So that's only a third of the time that life has existed on the earth. And the previous 1.5 billion years or 2.5 billion years, yeah, there was microbial life, but it was a pretty boring affair. There was not a lot going on other than these microbes, were living and doing their thing. So it takes disruptive events to sort of jolt evolution. And once that happens, then opportunities are opened up for a massive increase in complexity. And that's what we see happened on Earth, not once, but several times.
Well, I'm interested, when you were just saying that, it made me think of this kind of jolt we're all going through right now with this pandemic and the shift in consciousness also that you're talking about that's needed. And I wanted to get back to that and ask you what your thoughts are in general, for those who are curious and want to have that opening experience. Does everybody have to order ayahuasca online, or what's a container or practical ways to have this awakening happen through a connection with the plant?
Well, I think, you can order ayahuasca ingredients online and prepare them yourself and so on. Some people do, and that's fine. It's not fine in the sense that, ayahuasca is an increasingly threatened resource. But ideally, these compounds, and again, this is drawing on indigenous wisdom. These plant medicines are best used in a group setting with a shaman or a therapist or someone who provides the structure for the experience to unfold. Some people don't require that. They're perfectly capable of navigating these dimensions on their own. And I don't disrespect that. But for most of us, I think a well-structured group setting with therapeutic elements where there are people there who can provide support to the participants is the way to go. And a lot of, before COVID, people would go to South America and places like that to have these experiences and take ayahuasca in these settings. And COVID has pretty much shut that down for now, but COVID will not be here forever. And I think some interesting things are happening now because the laws are being changed. We see the decriminalization movements happening in different municipalities and in some cases on the even on the state level, movements to, for example, decriminalize psilocybin mushrooms seems to be a lot of the focus. Well, I hate the term decriminalize because it implies that these substances are criminals in some ways. They're not criminals. It all comes back to the way that people use them. There are many ways to use these things beneficially or harmfully. That comes down to people. But what seems to be happening now, I much prefer what I would like to see the current sort of psychedelic renaissance among the people. The direction I would like to see it go is that these centers are beginning to form, and a lot of them exist, but they're underground. But if you change the regulatory environment, then they can operate in the open. And rather than taking people to the medicine in South America or Africa or wherever you might go, bring the medicine here to these centers, work with the indigenous people to develop the right ritual frameworks and therapeutic framework. So bring the medicine to the people rather than the people to the medicine. Work with these indigenous communities to produce them in a sustainable way. Maximize the benefits, make sure that the indigenous groups have a place at the table always, and not just a small place, a big place, a big voice, because I think they have the right to say, we've been the stewards of these medicines for forever, depending on when you want to start counting, potentially 100,000 years. We know a thing or two. You should listen to us, and you should acknowledge that stewardship. So these centers have the potential to do that, where they don't. I mean, it doesn't work to just imitate what is done in the indigenous societies, but you can you can look at them. They provide a model, and then you can adapt that model to our own needs as global citizens in the 20th century post-electronic, post-technological world. Plant medicines are still one of the most important learning tools we have, basically, to try to evolve into better people on the individual and societal level. So we should not turn away from them.
Well, and I love that model of not just us going there, but bringing
the plants up. And this has been embodied in the myth, in the concept of the eagle and the condor. The eagle and the condor will come together at some point, and that's happening on a small scale, and I hope it continues to expand, because I think that is the best way to bring psychedelics into our culture in a way that acknowledges their origins and their roots, and that also avoids the temptation to hyper medicalize these substances. And that's what I see in a lot of the startup companies with the emphasis on psychedelic therapies. They want to create these highly structured clinical protocols. That's okay for certain situations, but it's by and large not the way it initially, and almost inevitably, it's going to create inequalities. People who want psychedelic therapy can go to a clinic and pay $30,000 and have their psilocybin trip, but that leaves out 99% of the people that can't really afford to do that and wouldn't want to anyway. I think most people's preference, if they had a preference, would be work with a natural medicine, because that they provides this link to the rest of the biosphere. And in most cases, the natural medicine are perfectly adequate and in some ways preferable to the to the medicalization. I mean, I see the need for that. I am a board member of the Hefter Research Institute, which has fostered a lot of this clinical work. You need both, but you need to create ways that people can afford to have access and find ways to access these medicines in their local communities, because the psychedelic the social context of these things is always, it's not, I mean, our approach to psychedelic therapy is very much focused on the individual. But these in indigenous cultures, the use of ayahuasca is a social phenomenon. It's part of the community support and the community dynamics. The shaman or the curandero is a revered person in the society. And until recently, I mean, now psychedelic tourism, ayahuasca tourism has resulted in, superstar ayahuasqueros, who go on trips globally, and that generates resentment sometimes within the community. Before all this started, the curandero was someone who he or she just lived in the community. Chances are had different methods of livelihood, was a farmer or a fisherman or something like that. And the curanderismo that they practiced on the side was not their main profession. It was something that they did as a service to the community. And I'd like to see, if possible, that kind of model return. These centers that I envision as the possible solution, if they could operate out in the open, they could offer a range of psychedelic therapies, but a range of medicines, but it would not necessarily be confined to that. It would be a place you could go, you could do holotropic breath work, you could do yoga, you could take advantage of a variety of wellness options to improve the health of mind and body. And the psychedelics would be a part of that, something that they could offer, not necessarily the sole focus of the activities there. So that's maybe a utopian vision, or probably a naive vision, I don't know. But there it is. That's my vision. That's the way I hope it goes.
Is that in a way, when you said before they would use ayahuasca as this in this social community, or had a social value, can you say a little bit more about what that meant in that context? And then I also want to add, if people do have questions, can you please enter them in the Q&A rather than the chat,
Sure.
because I can't follow the chat. But yeah, go ahead.
Sure. Well, ayahuasca and these plant medicines, because they are a practice of indigenous people, they've always had a social context. I mean, that's the way they're used. And they've always been something that the wider society, the dominator society, essentially in South America, the colonialist society, looks askance at, and has an interest in suppressing, or think they do. In a sense, I think there's a perception that they may be a threat to, say, established religious practices, established religions. And they often are, because they give people in these indigenous cultures something that they can value. They are a cultural revalorization, rediscovery of their own traditions. And that often doesn't serve the purposes of the dominating, economically dominating cultures. And then you've got the whole issue of religion and spirituality and all this. If you look at the history of the New World, the Spanish started to colonize the New World around the time of the Inquisition. And when they discovered these uses of sacred medicines, such as mushrooms, they were vilified. They were identified as blasphemous and brutally suppressed. And of course, it didn't succeed, because attempts to prohibit substances never succeeds, but it succeeded in driving it underground for 400 years. And then R. Gordon Wasson and his colleagues in the 1950s rediscovered it, not really. I mean, it was known that these mushrooms were used, but he was a representative of the elite culture, and he was able to visit these places where they were being used, publish this article in Life magazine. And that was really important for bringing psychedelics, at least the magic mushrooms, into mass consciousness. Very few people knew about it before that or cared, but that was an important article, even though in some ways it had consequences, unanticipated consequences, particularly for the shaman woman, Maria Sabina, that was his main informant. She freely shared her knowledge. He broadcast it to the world. She got very little back from it, except vilification, jealousy. She has said that Wasson effectively ruined her life. And I think that's true. But on the other hand, the rest of the world maybe should be grateful that he did make this discovery and bring it to the world. And now psilocybin has emerged as sort of the superstar psychedelic of the whole panoply, because it is so adaptable to therapeutic use, and it's non-toxic. It can be used even in people with fairly compromised states of health and so on. So here we have this ancient medicine that is perfectly suited to 21st century psychedelic therapy.
There's so much in that story, but I wanted to, for hours more conversation, but to follow up on the last point, because there's a question that relates to that. Christine asked, she wanted to know about the connection of psychedelics and the autoimmune system. I don't know if you have anything more to add to that.
I don't really have much more to add. I think she means probably the immune system. And there is evidence, there's an abundance of evidence that states of mind influence the immune response. If you're depressed, for example, you're much more vulnerable to infections and other things. If you're in a strong state of mind, your immune resistance goes up. So I am convinced that many psychedelics, that they trigger these cathartic, renewing experiences. I'm convinced that they're strong stimulants of the immune system. And there is evidence for that. Ayahuasca is a good example because, it's mind-body medicine. It affects the mind, certainly, but it affects a lot of the other systems in the body, including the immune system, that are involved in resistance to disease and that sort of thing. So there is evidence out there that they do.
Well, and kind of following on that, wait, I just lost it. Michael Heinrich had a question, and I'll just read it. He asked, should ayahuasca today be regulated as a prescription or other form of a medicine? The setting and the social context of the traditional use is gone under these modern uses. I'm not quite. So would this be a way to ascertain better and more sustainable use, or should we trust those who have the experience?
I think that we should, by and large, trust those that have the experience. I would not want to see ayahuasca regulated as a prescription medicine. And I think it's not necessary. I think that's over-regulation, and I think it's a co-optation of this tradition. This is basically the Western biomedical establishment coming in and say, okay, you people have used this for 10,000 years, but we'll just take it over now and we'll set all these rules about how it should be used. I think that's over-regulation. That's hyper-medicalization. I think the solution is education. And that's a lot of what the McKenna Academy is supposedly about. And that's the approach should be taken, is that people should be educated not just about the use of psychedelics. They should be educated in non-judgmental ways about the use of any kind of psychoactive substance that they may encounter, because we live in a world that's permeated with these things. We encounter many psychotropic substances. So the educational message should be that drug abuse is something that arises out of human behavior. These substances are not inherently bad. The substances are simply what they are. It's the uses that we make of them that can be very harmful if they're misused. We even see this in indigenous context with the practice of brujeria and sorcery and this kind of thing. We see it very much often in the therapeutic context. There are a number of scandals now involving therapists that have used psychedelics with patients and in inappropriate ways. But this all comes from the human behavior, and people have to be educated in their use of psychedelics. And I would say, primarily come to it from an informed place, learn about what you're doing, approach it thoughtfully, approach it carefully, approach it in some ways reverently. I mean, that has religious context, but I think it's true. Approach it as a valuable experience that's going to have great meaning in your life. If you understood that that's what it's all about, then you come to it with the right attitude. And Roland Griffith's work and other practitioners, but particularly his work with psilocybin and at the end of life, and psilocybin in the mystical experience of, and he doesn't call it mystical experience because that has a religious context, but what he says is that in the right context, these psychedelics could produce these profoundly meaningful personal experiences, often the most meaningful experience of your entire life. And his published work reflects this. So if you're going to engage in an activity that might be the most meaningful experience you will ever have, it's worth approaching it carefully and thoughtfully and not in a casual way. Prepare yourself, become informed about what you're doing, think about what you're doing, optimize the setting, and ideally work with a practitioner that understands this dynamic and can help guide you through it without dominating your experience, but just be supportive as you go through this process.
Yeah. Can we go over like 5 or 10 minutes? Because there's a couple of questions I'd love to.
Yes, of course.
So
No problem.
This one follows on what you're saying, and you're talking about, the importance of what we might bring to the experience. And this question, Florian asks about, on the other side, the plant medicine itself, and what about what you think about the commercialization of psilocybin and other plant spirit medicines, and how can we maintain the sacredness of these teachers in light of these companies' efforts?
Very good question, and one that a lot of people are pondering. And I think that the model I talked about, I think as we move forward, the primary thing is that we have to acknowledge the contribution of Indigenous people, and we need to make sure that they have a strong place at the table and an important megaphone to talk about this. So that, to the extent possible, I think that the production and the use of these medicines should be under the stewardship of Indigenous groups, interfacing with therapeutic groups in the States or wellness retreat centers in the States and that sort of thing. But the Indigenous people should be the kind of the council of elders, which they really are, in terms of the way that these medicines are going to be brought into our society. Now, on the other side, there is the interest in developing new analogs of psychedelics and this sort of thing, the whole medicinal chemistry, clinical therapeutic approach. I don't see that, I mean, as a scientist, I'm interested in discovery, and I don't see that that can be prohibited. But on the other hand, the scientific establishment should not turn around and say, well, unless you come to our clinic and use our protocols, then you're prohibited from doing this. If you want to use indigenous protocols, if you want to go into the woods and eat mushrooms on your own, this should not be prohibited. I mean, this is, it just shouldn't. It should be a basic human right to form symbiotic relationships with these plants, because that's really what's going on. That said, the people that want to do this have a certain responsibility to do it responsibly, both for themselves and other people. This stuff doesn't happen in isolation. So that's, but I don't want to see it become something that is approved for, the scientific biomedical community and not the indigenous community or just ordinary people like us. We should have the right to have access to these medicines and should not have to fear prosecution or all of that comes with that. I mean, the very idea that we as a society arrogated to ourselves the right to prohibit these substances and these plants, it's just that's the example of the complete misunderstanding of our relationship with nature. And no, we do not control nature, and we have to realize that.
Well, and that kind of flows into this. Maybe I'll make the last question. This is a question from Jorgen Anderson. He asked, does Dennis think that psychedelic plants are going to be a necessary facilitator for the social and technological changes that are needed for solving the climate crisis?
Yes, absolutely. They are in several ways. Because they help us focus on this issue, they bring this issue of our relationship to nature to the foreground. Often when people have these profound experiences, what they come away with, even though they may not have been expecting it, they come away with this new, renewed perspective on our relationship with nature and a realization that, we are getting out of sync with nature, and we need to return to that. We need to reestablish this symbiotic relationship, particularly with plants, because they're so important to life on Earth. We need to rediscover and re-implement that model. I think that's very important. But then on the environmental side, part of this response is to propagate these plants to ensure that there are sustainable sources of them. And again, that should be under the direction of the indigenous people. We should work with indigenous communities to grow all of these plants that potentially will be used. Ayahuasca is a very good example of this. Ayahuasca, and when you do that, that is part of the environmental restoration. Ayahuasca, one component is it's a vine. It's a huge jungle liana. So you get a few of those going in acreages. That's helping to, fix lots of carbon and that sort of thing. Mushrooms, same thing. Mushrooms can be sustainably grown because they're so easily cultivated. So there aren't the same issues with depleting the supply of mushrooms, because you can pretty much grow tons of it rather easily. But the supplies of rare and endangered plants like ayahuasca or iboga, we have to have a lot of clarity about this. I don't think we can fence them off. I don't think we can say no one should take ayahuasca, no one should take iboga, because these plants are just too valuable for our needs. But we should try and ensure ways that develop infrastructures to sustainably produce these medicines, so we're not in danger of depleting them. Right now, it's a problem with, especially with iboga and with ayahuasca, also with peyote to a certain extent, even more so. In various Native American groups have actually said, with respect to these decriminalization movements, they've said, we want to opt out. We don't want anyone to exploit peyote because it's just too endangered. I don't really agree that keeping it illegal, keeping it prohibited is a solution. Again, it comes back to education. I think we have to educate the community that, peyote, we should try to avoid its use. We should make sure that indigenous communities have enough for their own purposes, and it's a slow grower. It's harder to propagate on a mass scale. You can with ayahuasca and things like that. Peyote, not so much. So my response to the people that say, it should opt out of the decrim movements, I would say no, it should not be criminalized, because no plant at all should ever be criminalized. But that said, you can educate people about a responsible way to use peyote and look at seek consensus agreement that, okay, we'll leave it alone. We'll just, not that it's prohibited, just that in the interest of responsible use, we will leave that to the indigenous people.
So
Sense.
yeah, of all this, we could continue so long. And what strikes me so much is going back to the beginning, that the intersection of these different ways of knowing and how all these issues are so overlapping and interconnected. And by bringing the perspective you do, it's not either or, it's the layers of complexity that
Exactly
is needed to. And so my last question is, and I think in part you've answered it by your perspective that you've shared, but I'm curious if you look back to that first moment when you first awoke to these issues until now, how this work has changed you. And obviously that's a huge question, but if there's specific.
Well, I guess it depends on how far back do you want to go. Psychedelics, from my late teen years has always been sort of my obsession, in a certain sense. And so that's my curiosity about the plants, the indigenous context, the experiences themselves have been, both a sort of personal spiritual activities, a quest, if you will, and also a scientific quest, a professional quest. And that continues as I've seen the context of all this change, as psychedelics are becoming almost respectable again, they're becoming destigmatized and so on. My own perspective has changed. I think in the last few years, I have organized ayahuasca retreats. I've done that really off and on for over 20 years. In the last 10 years, I used to organize 3 or 4 a year in South America. And so I was part of this ayahuasca tourism phenomena, although I think we tried to provide a good connection to the indigenous people and respect for the culture and so on. But basically, I was enticing people with the ability to pay to come down there and have these experiences. And it did many of them a lot of good. But I've come to think that there are just moral dilemmas in a certain way about doing it that way, and in some because it's a question of, you're bringing Westerners who are not part of the culture. They bring money to the culture. They bring their own Western expectations to it. And naturally, it being a free market, that's going to change the traditions. The traditions have changed in South America in response to the expectations of the clientele. And this is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just the way it is. I mean, back in 20, 30, 40 years ago, in traditional ayahuasca practices, the shaman took the medicine. The patients did not take the medicine. The shamans took it as a diagnostic tool so they could, through the visionary insights, come to conclusions about what plants and other processes might be used to cure people, where no Westerner is going to put up with that. They come down, they expect to take the medicine. And so, the indigenous group accommodate that. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's just important to acknowledge that it's changed the tradition, it's changed the practices, and it also has economic impacts on these communities, beneficial in some ways, not so beneficial in other ways. So I think we need to evolve beyond that notion of ayahuasca tourism and get to this other model where, rather than taking people to the plants, bring the plants to the people. Not saying that doesn't have pitfalls of itself. I mean, we will discover what they are as we do this, but I think it's a healthier direction to go at this point.
We've come to the end of the time, but in closing, is there any other last point you would like to make? Or
well, no, I think we covered it pretty well. I'm happy. I want to draw attention to the McKenna Academy. You can find it on McKenna.academy is the website, and I urge people to look at that and look at some of the events that we have online. We've done webinars on Symbiosis, various fireside chat with luminaries such as Wade Davis and Paul Stamets and so on. So in trying to fulfill its mission as an educational institution, the Academy is our campus for the moment. There may be actual campuses at some point, but right now it's all virtual. So if you like what we're doing, register for our mailing list, donate money if you want. We're a 501c3 nonprofit, so we can actually give tax deductions for that. And mostly stay tuned, and we welcome feedback and inquiries from everyone.
And do you want to show everyone your shirt?
Oh, my shirt again?
Not everybody saw it.
Ayahuasca t-shirt, yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. It's been such an honor to speak with you, and I so appreciate the far-reaching exploration and the way
we went far beyond ethnobotany, or maybe the take-home lesson is ethnobotany just isn't about plants. It's about people and plants, and that gets complicated.
Right. Well, thank you so much.
And thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
All right, I will say goodbye. Okay. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.